Castlevania is the timeless tale of good versus evil, pitting the Prince of Darkness Dracula against the very strong and proud Belmont clan, whose vampire killer whip is the only means of defeating the evil Dracula. In these games, it's always the same story for the most part. One of the Belmonts goes on an adventure and tries to defeat Dracula in his castle, known as Castlevania. If he succeeds, the day is saved. When it comes to anime and manga, there are a lot of different series that do the same thing, but in my case, there's one series that I really care about, and that's Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. Now, the relationship between these two is kind of interesting, because a lot of people like to compare Jojo's Bizarre Adventure Phantom Blood, the very first part of Jojo, with Castlevania, and that's pretty understandable. Both series feature vampires, they both feature the undead horde, and of course both feature a brave, burly, strong, massive warrior going on a quest to defeat the evil vampire at the end. So, what I'm going to do today is something that I think is pretty fun. I'm going to compare Jonathan Joestar and his abilities to the challenge faced in the very first Castlevania game, usually performed by Simon Belmont. Also, spoiler warning. If you don't want to have JoJo Part 1 spoiled for you, or the events of Castlevania, go and check them out before watching this video, then come back and resume from here. Alright, there's your warning. Now let's get into it. Before I go into the details of what Simon's different adventures included, I want to talk about Jonathan Joestar's life, because I think it's very important that we understand who he is and what he's able to do, so that we can make an educated decision on the different challenges he'll be facing later. Jonathan Joestar had a hard life. The things around him just never really worked out the right way. It wasn't because Jonathan did anything wrong, but because people around him were not good people. The most important of these people is a man named Dio Brando, who would be adopted into the Joestar family after his father Dario Brando passed away. Dio made it his life's purpose to ruin Jonathan. He wanted to be the sole inheritor of the Joestar estate, and he felt the best way to do that was to just completely break his adoptive brother. Unfortunately for Dio, and fortunately for everyone else, Jonathan never broke. No matter what happened to him, he always kept firing back with an even greater resolve, and in some cases, because of these adversities, Jonathan became an even more powerful person. He learned to stand on his own 2 feet and fight no matter what it took. Jonathan is the embodiment of what a true gentleman should be, in the most chivalrous traditional sense. He fights with honor, integrity, and more. For this video, we're going to use Jonathan at his peak. So he's 20 years old, 195 centimeters tall, which is 6'5" for those of us who don't use the metric system, and 105 kilograms, which is 231 pounds or so. Jojo's Bizarre Adventure gives us the wonderful opportunity to see what it was like for Jonathan growing up, and among the things he did was box among the youth. Jonathan was actually very good at it. Until Dio Brando showed up, he was the local champion. So he already knows how to fight before we even get into his older years. And once he goes off to university, after a large time skip, we're seeing him running as an athlete on a rugby field. And not only is he a rugby star, but this guy is running while 3 people are hanging on to him. Jonathan is not something to just mess around with. This dude is scary strong. And it doesn't stop there. We get to see a few more instances of how tough he is when he goes on different adventures in the first parts of the story. First off, he takes a trip down to Ogre Street, where he goes and fights off several thugs, including the very powerful and menacing Interrupting Ario's Speedwagon. And later, when he has to fight Dio, who just turned into a vampire, he manages to defeat him. For an exceptionally strong human being, this entire feat was still kind of impossible, so it's really worth mentioning here. I also mentioned his intellect. That's pretty significant. Jonathan is an educated man. He went on to the university and studied at the academic level, so the guy is well-read, and he has a pretty good understanding of things that he's studied. Jonathan's not an idiot, is really the point I'm trying to make here. Now, what's really interesting is that Jonathan's power doesn't stop there. In fact, this is just where it begins, because Jonathan, as it turns out, had the potential for an ancient martial arts technique called Hamon, or the Ripple. Fundamentally, the Ripple is the ability to fight harnessing the power of the sun. The Ripple can destroy the undead. It's his secret weapon, and the only thing that can really get the job done other than the sun itself. When it comes to his aptitude and mastery of the Ripple, Jonathan is described as having a 1 in a million potential. The man who trained him, William Zeppeli, trained for years to be a Hamon master. Jonathan picks it up in just a few weeks. The fact that he had such rapid growth is indicative of just how incredible Jonathan really is. And some of the different techniques he develops while fighting on his way to defeat Dio, I'm going to just touch on a couple of them that I think are worth mentioning because they're the ones that would probably be the most relevant in what's going on here. So the first would be the zoom punch. The zoom punch is essentially being able to stretch out your arm and turning it into a longer ranged weapon. Another example would be looking at Dhalsim from Street Fighter, whose actual techniques were based on Jonathan Joestar's zoom punch. The next thing I want to talk about is called Sendo Hamon Overdrive. Sendo Hamon is the ability to send Hamon into an object. What this really means is if he punches it and imbues it with ripple, anything that touches it will be hit by the ripple energy. So this is useful for creating traps, setting up barriers, and things of that nature. If an undead thing gets hit by it, they get spun around and get destroyed from the inside by the ripple, so it's a pretty effective technique. The last one I'm going to talk about is the most iconic Sunlight Yellow Overdrive. This is Jonathan Joestar's Ora attack, which is just an endless barrage of punches, and in doing so, whatever he punches also gets overwhelmingly blasted with ripple energy. So if you are an undead being, if you get hit with this, you're done. Hamon also has some pretty interesting healing properties and kind of the power of life itself. We won't go too much into that, but I just want to acknowledge that they do exist, so if Jonathan gets hurt, he can help himself out a bit with Hamon healing energy. As long as Jonathan is able to breathe, because the ripple is controlled through proper breathing techniques, he's able to use it, which means you don't need sunlight. It's all within yourself. Considering what we're going to be sending Jonathan up against, it's pretty easy to assume that, yeah, this is probably going to be his most valuable weapon, but in my opinion, it's actually his second greatest weapon. Jonathan Joestar's single most valuable tool in his whole toolset is his unwavering resolve. Jonathan Joestar has such passion and fire that even when he delivers the Sunlight Yellow Overdrive, he talks about his burning heart. Jonathan's sense of justice and willingness to do what he must do just out of willful obligation is frankly terrifying. This guy has overpowered enemies just because he refused to let himself fail. And it's not one of those things where it's anime nonsense. It's one of those things where you really do have a sense of he's going to pay the price, but he's going to get the job done. And that is really what sets Jonathan Joestar apart from a lot of different anime heroes and makes him one of my favorite of all time. For JoJo's Bizarre Adventure into Castlevania, I'm going to be giving Jonathan everything that he has by the time he faces Dio, which is all of his Hamon abilities, as well as his Sword of Luck and Pluck. Additionally, for his equipment, he's going to be wearing his usual shoulder pads and a backpack, because you got to be able to carry your stuff. Now that we've covered everything Jonathan's got, let's talk about his actual success. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure into Castlevania begins with the very beginning of the castle. This is the front entrance. Here, JoJo's only going to have to fight things like ghouls, zombies, flying bats, and the occasional panther. Once he goes underground, he's also going to have to contend with mermen. Now what's interesting here is that he can just walk on water if he was really in such a pinch. This is something that Hamon users are proven to do, so this won't be a big problem for Jonathan. Continuing on to the final fight of this particular stage, he's going to be facing a giant bat. I don't think that's going to be an issue for him because all he needs to do is land a zoom punch to grab the thing. Whether it's an undead creature that can be destroyed by Hamon or just an evil bat, he can destroy it either way. Stage 2 is going to play out pretty differently for Jonathan. It's a much more vertical stage and it has some unique gimmicks that weren't present in Stage 1. Among them are the different enemies he's going to be facing. On this stage, Jonathan's going to have to defeat some knights wielding spears, as well as the Medusa heads, among other enemies. The interesting thing about the knights is if he manages to defeat one, which I think he'll be able to pull off using his Hamon, especially conducted through the metal of their armor, he'll now have a spear that he can use at any point for the rest of the experience. Jonathan has this tendency to pick up things whenever he's in an area and use them however he can. Whether it's a spear that he deftly wields, or even some roses that he picks up, this is a battle tendency that's going to help him through the entire journey. The dropping platforms and spike things and everything of that nature, they're going to kill you if you touch them. Knowing Jonathan, he's probably not going to fall into those traps. We've seen this guy fall into giant pits of fire and climb right back out just by stabbing the wall fast enough. So I'm not going to be too worried about him getting crushed by something he can just walk past fast enough. After all, the guy is an athlete with full power and speed. Stage 2 ends with Queen Medusa. This is probably the most challenging thing for Jonathan to face on an emotional level. The reason is, in order to defeat her, he's going to have to hit a woman. As a gentleman, that's probably not something he's going to be very comfortable with. Ultimately, it's going to be decided that, even though she is a woman, she's also a representative of evil, and he must do it. But it's not something that he's going to do so lightheartedly. If anything, he'll curse Dracula for forcing him to have to fight against a woman, and perform such an unspeakable act as striking one. Jonathan runs into another issue against Medusa. That's the fact that she's not like the other creatures around here. I don't think she counts as undead by any means. She's a Gorgon. And traditionally speaking, Gorgons turn you to stone if you stare them in the eye. Now, I would say that if Jonathan saw this woman, he would have no issue understanding who and what she was, because he is very well read on archaeology and things of that nature. Studying Greek mythology just seems kind of like a prerequisite for getting through the course. The snakes that Medusa shoots at him while she floats around the room are going to be problematic for most people. Whether they're poisonous or not, well, it doesn't really matter, because Jonathan, as a matter of fact, has already fought somebody just like this, named Doobie. When Jonathan faced Doobie, he was actually bitten by poisonous snakes. Instead of succumbing to poison, Jonathan just used his Hamon to expel the poison from his body. Essentially, the fight against Doobie is the fight against Medusa. The only difference is, how does she die? She's a floating head, so you can't really cut off her head like the mythology implies you should. If it comes down to using Hamon or just using the Sword of Luck and Pluck, then it's just going to come down to a brutality contest, and I think Jonathan's very capable of doing it. Stage 3 is a pretty high-flying area, and by that I mean Jonathan's going to be going up into some pretty great heights, dealing with flying enemies and other things that are flying out of the sky. He can fall here, and honestly, that would kill most people, so we have to be mindful of the danger, but we also can consider the fact that the entire map, thanks to the design of the sprites, appears to be covered in different kinds of foliage. This gives Jonathan a pretty unique advantage as well. In a different instance, Jonathan was once shown using several leaves to create a parachute so he could fall safely to the ground using magnetism and Hamon. So if he does happen to fall, there's always some way for him to save himself. But we're not going to assume that he's going to fall. We're just going to let Jonathan make his way through this journey. On this particular stage, he's going to be fighting the usual enemies, and they're going to be giving him the usual amount of trouble. Honestly, most of them are undead aside from the birds, so that's going to actually be pretty easy for him to deal with. The big challenge would normally be the mummy at the end, but what are mummies? They're undead. It's a one-hit KO kind of deal. That's a win. Stage 3 is no problem for Jonathan Joestar. Stage 4. Now this is quite the dangerous stage, and for me was one of the hardest parts of Castlevania. But going through Stage 4, you've got a lot of things to worry about. First off, you start in the underground area, which is a giant body of water. Whether or not this is the river Styx, I'm not sure, but if it isn't, unlike people such as Simon Belmont and others who'd be contending with whatever's lurking in the waters, Jonathan could legitimately just walk across it and do whatever he had to do to keep going. Once he gets to the above part, he's going to be dealing with several flea men being dropped down. Now the flea men are not like other creatures. They don't appear to be undead or anything like that. They're just small human-like creatures that jump around and are fairly annoying. You can just run away. A full-powered run would probably be fine, and we know that this guy can hustle. After all, even if he had several flea men trying to hold him down, it doesn't matter. We've already seen what this guy can do with 3 fully trained athletes holding him down. He just keeps going. At the end of that run would be the white dragon, the bone snake hanging on the wall. It's an undead enemy, so guess what? Hamon. The big challenge of Stage 4 for most people, including Simon and anyone else who tried to do it, would of course be the boss waiting at the end. The creature. It's very strong, and it has a little flea man named Igor assisting it. Simon Belmont is able to handle this problem because he has the vampire killer, which means he has a ranged attack, plus his sub-weapons to get the job done. He could potentially stay out of reach of the entire thing, and that would be great. According to the Castlevania lore, the creature's a zombie, so no matter how strong it really is, it's not really a problem. Jonathan Joestar has the natural skills already predetermined to destroy this thing. And if we're talking about how strong it might be, being a question of whether or not Jonathan could defeat it, we have another example of an overpowering giant zombie in Tarkus. Jonathan was able to defeat Tarkus, especially after receiving the power-up from William Zeppelin, so this thing is just another example of that. Jonathan Joestar has no issues defeating the creature at the end of Stage 4. Stage 5 is one of the harder stages in the entire game, and for most people, probably where you die. There are regenerating zombie skeleton things, and there are also knights that throw axes, so these two enemies make for an additional challenge that is a little different. Additionally, we also have the Medusa heads coming back in full force, and they are a nuisance to be reckoned with. For Jonathan, the biggest challenge definitely comes from these axe throwers. Whether or not he can get by them is no longer a question of whether or not Hamon overpowers something, but whether or not he has the ability, being nimble enough and fast enough and strong enough to overcome these enemies. I'm not going to say that he's able to snatch these out of the sky necessarily. I'm not even going to go that far. I'm just going to say that Jonathan, more than anything, would probably do his best to overcome these things in the most efficient way he could. If all he needs is Hamon to defeat these things, then the good news is Sendo Hamon puts him on the same plane, sends the Hamon through the ground, and destroys them from where he's standing. And if we're going to assume holy water has similar properties to it, then we can assume it's going to work. The biggest challenge for Stage 5 is definitely going to be the boss. Death, the Grim Reaper, Stage 5's final guardian. This thing is a pain in the ass. Death is very challenging, and for a number of reasons, it's very difficult to defeat him. Simon Belmont has the advantage of holy water, and of course the vampire killer, but even then, he's got to constantly be dodging scythes, sickles, and whatever's flying through the air while Death is doing his thing. For Jonathan, he doesn't exactly have the best track record with Death. Yeah. I find that in this section, Death is floating around, and because he's not touching any flat surface, Jonathan can't use the usual Hamon trick to just reach across the map and get him. I don't know that touching Death with your bare hands is a smart choice either. So we're going to say that Jonathan cannot use the zoom punch, and cannot do those usual things he's been doing. This is where things get desperate. Let's say that Jonathan gets hit with one of these dangerous scythes or sickles. We know how Jonathan acts when things get stabbed into him. They become a weapon that he can use. So just like he did when he fought against Dio and was impaled by a spear, Jonathan's going to probably reach into his shoulder or wherever he got hit by this scythe, pull it out, imbue it with Hamon, and then throw it like it's a rugby pass at Death. The reason that Death can be defeated here is because he is of the darkness attribute. And according to the Castlevania lore, light and holy energy are super effective against darkness. Obviously, Hamon is light. It is the power of sunlight itself, and that Castlevania is always shrouded in darkness only further supports the danger of sunlight. So if Jonathan is able to weaponize one of the scythes, then that would work. And if he can't, well, we still do have the spear if he kept it from earlier, or his Sword of Luck and Pluck, which, if he really needed to throw it, I suppose he could get away with doing so. Either way, this is one of the hardest fights for Jonathan on a combat level, because Death is not a pushover, he's not a normal zombie, and he's not just one little Hamon blast away. This is one of those fights that's going to force Jonathan to use his head and be smart, and like I mentioned, maybe even get injured so that he can weaponize the thing that the Grim Reaper used against him. All in all, a tough battle, but I think Jonathan can overcome it. Finally, we move into Stage 6, the last hurrah of the game. This is where everything's going to come down to. For Jonathan, this is not going to be easy as much as anything else was easy. Mainly because he's going to be dodging these giant vampire bats, which are probably not too keen on letting him get through, and then going through the clock tower segment, which is a pain in the butt. I do think that his abilities do get him through it, especially because Hamon has so many practical uses, but the real question that we're going to talk about here is whether or not Jonathan has what it takes to defeat Dracula. The fight with Dracula is definitely something very challenging because we don't know for sure whether or not the usual means of warfare against vampires apply here. Dracula is an undead creature, but does sunlight kill him? Well, that's where the challenge comes in. We have to determine whether or not Dracula is actually weak enough to sunlight that Jonathan can vanquish him. Additionally, we're going to be dealing with the different forms of Dracula, being his normal rather human-looking form, and then his true vampiric form where he becomes a flying creature. The question therein lies, will Dracula be defeated by this? Well, we have an answer. In Super Castlevania IV, at the end of the game, once Dracula is defeated, he turns into several bats, and then sunlight destroys him. In Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, the same thing happens. Once he's defeated, sunlight rains in through the window, and the Prince of Darkness is disintegrated. As we have proven by comparing it with other games in the Castlevania franchise, Dracula can indeed be defeated with the power of sunlight. Meaning, in reviewing everything that we've talked about today, I'm convinced that Jonathan Joestar has both the ability and the will to overcome all of the challenges that Simon Belmont faced in his first adventure. I'm StanPie, thank you so much for sticking around for this video and going through this bizarre adventure with me. If you enjoyed it, be sure to click subscribe, like, and all the other stuff that usually get asked of you at the end of a video. I want to thank my man Zia from Geek Tank for helping me with some of the information about Dracula's weaknesses so that I could make my assertion, and you can feel free to check out his channel right there below. As for me, I'm going to continue thinking about these amazing two franchises that I like so much. And maybe, just maybe, we'll take a look at them again someday. Until next time, this is StanPie. Thanks for watching.